Hello, Archie Dunlop here with Talking Astrology with Archie. And in this video, I'm going to be looking at the weekend of April the 12th and 13th, 2025. Have you read the novel Black Easter by James Blish? It's a fun novel. It's quite short. I would recommend it. It was written in 1968 and it's about a black magician, and it kind of fantasizes about what would happen if the magic as described in sort of medieval grimoires was to be able to used effectively in the modern world. And I'm wondering if, in terms of everything that's going on at the moment, it might all feel a bit like Black Easter. So here is the Wikipedia entry for Black Easter. I'll just read the first paragraph of it. Black Easter is a fantasy novel by American writer James Blish, in which an arms dealer hires a black magician to unleash all the demons of hell on Earth for a single day. The novel initially depicts the assassination of a governor of California, a fictionalized version of Ronald Reagan, by a black magician working as a contract killer. The same magician is then hired to release every demon in hell for a brief time period. However, the demons cannot actually be returned to hell by the end of the novel. Their traditional opponent, God, has already retired, and nobody else can compel them to return to hell. And maybe at the moment it kind of feels a bit like that. The world is very chaotic, and April is chaotic. And I remember on the 1st of April I mentioned the poem, T.S. Eliot's poem The Wasteland, where he talks about April being the cruelest month. And this weekend, the weekend of April the 12th and the 13th, we have this full moon, and this full moon is on the Pluto-Hades midpoint, and I talked about that yesterday on Friday. I think I'm going to talk about Pluto and Hades with midpoint again, with some past examples of how Pluto and Hades are working, because it is really a difficult pairing, particularly when you look at examples of people and events which took place or were born with a sun on the Pluto-Hades midpoint. And then also this weekend, additionally, we've got Venus going stationary direct, and this takes place, I think, within 41 minutes of the full moon. So everything is going on, and it might not seem much fun, and it might indeed feel that we've got a run up to a Black Easter. I mean, I'm sure it's not going to be as bad as that, and I'm not predicting anyone is going to open up the gates of hell, but I thought I'd point you to that novel. It's a really interesting novel. It's a fun novel, and it's very short. I don't know whether it's still in print, but I'm sure you can get a copy. So let's look at what's happening today. By the way, if you do happen to like this video, I'd be very grateful if you were to like it. If you're not subscribed, super grateful if you were to become a subscriber, because it does make a difference to my channel. Of course, I have to say that, don't I? So let's see what's happening today. Here is the picture for today. By the way, that is not a full moon. That is that's a planet Venus, and that is a reminder that Venus does go stationary direct today. And so looking at what's going on. So here's the chart for the weekend. Sorry, let me just turn my phone off. Here's the chart for the weekend. As always, it's set for New York at noon, and so noon, halfway through the weekend, or at midnight on April the 13th, and so right in the middle of a weekend, we've got the moon in Libra, and so it's late Libra, and that means that for most of us, we can really regard, well, for all of us, we can regard Saturday as being a complete moon in Libra day. Sunday, the moon does start moving into Scorpio. So with the sun in Libra, we could say that we're trying to make things easy for ourselves, trying to keep it civilized in times which might sometimes feel very uncivilized. And that moon in Libra is influenced by the fact that it's full, it's opposition the sun, and so it's a full moon weekend, and we can't avoid that. And because it's a full moon weekend, it might be a time when a certain cycle has reached its culmination, where something has reached its peak. It's not going to improve, it's not going to get better, or perhaps it's not going to get any worse either. And full moons can be a time of revelation. We see things for how they are, if we're honest with ourselves. And that's always the issue with full moons. The truth is available, but can we deal with the truth? Can we be honest about it? And if things have been happening over the last couple of weeks, and certainly things have been happening over the last couple of weeks in a political sense and an economic sense, look what's happened with tariffs, but with a full moon, we see things for how they are, for how things are actually how things are actually working out. Don't forget that Donald Trump has got a full moon in his chart. So if you're Donald Trump, you maybe with this full moon you've started this tariff war. Now you see the consequences. Now that doesn't mean to say that he was wrong or indeed right to start his tariff war. I don't have an opinion. I don't know enough about economics to be able to judge his tariff war. Now, the moon you can see, is in the Via Combusta. The Via Combusta, remember, is a part of the sky that is between 15 degrees Libra and 15 degrees Scorpio. And the moon is in the Via Combusta every month. But it's not every month is there a full moon in the Via Combusta. So when the moon is in either Libra or Scorpio every year, there will be a time when it is full, when you have that Via Combusta full moon. Now, I would have said, all things being equal, a Scorpio Via Combusta new moon is going to be more of a problem, but I think in this case, this year, the Via Combusta full moon is going to be in Libra. I mean, sometimes you will occasionally get two Via Combusta full moons, but usually it's just one. And so that may say something about this full moon. I've already said with this full moon in my yesterday's video that it is a bit weird, the fact that it is conjunct Chiron, and additionally it's on the Pluto-Hades midpoint, and I really want to go into that Pluto-Hades midpoint at the end of this video. I mean, I already mentioned it in yesterday's video, but I want to look at a few examples of it. And in terms of the Via Combusta, when does the moon go into the Via Combusta? So the moon goes into the Via Combusta on Saturday. I make it at 3:28 in the morning. And so you can see at 3:28 in the morning London time, the moon is at exactly 15 degrees Scorpio. Sorry, 15 degrees Virgo. So that's when the moon is halfway through the sign of Libra. That's when it goes into Via Combusta. So 3 in the morning, in 3:28 in the morning. Actually, I made it 3:28 and 26 seconds. That's New York time. Sorry, not London time. So New York time at 3:30 in the morning, which would be sort of around 8:30 in the morning if you're in the UK, or 9:30 in the morning if you're in continental Europe. Of course, that's going to be Saturday evening if you're in Australia or New Zealand. So you can see that on Saturday, Moon is moving into Via Combusta. And so at a time when we've got a full moon, we've got Venus stationary direct. So that just tells us about what the weekend should, in theory, be like, what it could be like. May not be what it's like for us as individuals, but it could be a weekend that where things are happening, and it is probably significant, the fact that Venus is going direct at 2:03 a.m. London time on Sunday, just 41 minutes away from the full moon. So you've got two changing cycles. You've got the moon moving from being waxing to waning at the same time as Venus is going direct, very, very close together. And when you've got two cycles changing at the same time, that can be somewhat seismic. And we might see the results on Monday as next week progresses. I've certainly noticed with Mercury going stationary direct or stationary retrograde at the same time as a lunation, is that can have an influence on the markets. And the markets are already pretty wild, so it will be really interesting to see what the markets are like on Monday. But just remember, I'm not giving any financial or investment advice. If you actually tried to use statistics to see if there's any correlation, generally these things don't work out. People have tried very hard to use statistics to establish that astrology works, and they've always failed. People talk about Gogolin, but even with Gogolin, I think it suggested he fell into the multiple comparison trap, that he did too many analyses, and of course every analysis has a statistical chance of being a false positive, and if you do too many, you statistically stack things in your favor. So even Gogolin's statistics, which sound so impressive, may not be flawed. And I'm not someone who thinks that there's any real chance of statistics showing that astrology works. So the question is, how does astrology work? Why am I doing what I'm doing? Well, there are other interpretations, and we shouldn't get too hung up on the scientific method. And so, aside from that, we've got the moon moving into Scorpio. That happens on Sunday. So Sunday afternoon at 2:54 p.m. London time, moon goes into Scorpio. Sunday morning, moon moves into Scorpio if you're in the Americas. So that is another changeover, and that might mean that Sunday could be a different day or feel different from Saturday. So what did I say? If it's 2:54 in the afternoon London time, that means that it's 9:54 in the morning Eastern Standard Time, or 6:54 if you're in the morning on the West Coast. So yes, so if you're in the Americas, you possibly could regard Sunday as being a moon in Scorpio day. And if you're in Australia or New Zealand, well, you don't need to worry about moon in Scorpio. That happens tomorrow. So those are a few thoughts about what's going on. I mean, on a positive note, on Saturday there is a trine between Moon and Jupiter, and so it could well be that Saturday is actually a less complicated, easier day than Sunday. So that's a moon. That's a chart of a Via Combusta. So that's a chart of the positions of the planets set for New York. And if we switch that to Sydney, there's a chart set for Sydney. So at midnight, the middle of a weekend, the moon is at 18 Libra. So that emphasizes a point that in Australia or New Zealand, you don't have to worry about moon in Scorpio. Moon is at 18 Libra halfway through the weekend. Moon won't go into Scorpio until very late on Sunday, or maybe even into Monday. And so that's That's Australia, New Zealand, East Asia. So but there's a bit of a difference there, but I don't think that there is necessarily going to be a huge difference. It's not just about the moon. We've still got Venus going direct. We've still got a full moon. So there you can see if that's the middle of a weekend. So the full moon is going to take place, if you're in Australia or New Zealand, fairly early on Sunday. So that's something to look forward to. And heliocentrically, here's the positions of a weekend, putting the sun at the center of the solar system. And a reminder here, one thing I didn't mention is that Chiron is exactly conjunct the sun now this weekend, geocentrically. Heliocentrically, that means that the Earth is opposition Chiron. So this weekend we really get it. And that is another thing about this full moon being conjunct Chiron. We have a real chance to see how Chiron is working. And are we going to see Chiron as the wounded healer? The wound is the wound going to be apparent, or is it going to be about wanting to do things differently, wanting to be a rebel, or is it perhaps going to be a bit of both? And aside from that, we have some of the same aspects that we had yesterday, although probably not as strongly. We've still got Venus making a sextile to Mars. We have all the sort of the charisma and attractiveness of that heliocentric Venus sextile Mars that we had on Friday. Maybe not as exact, but it's still there. It's something we can take advantage of. Additionally, Mercury is still square Mars. So Mercury square Mars, how do we make sense of things? And when we are confused, what do? We don't want to lash out with our words, as some people might. There could be quite a lot of frustration and anger this weekend, but we don't really want to be part of it. We don't have to be part of it if we don't want to be. So that's a picture this weekend. I would have said astrologically that this weekend is quite hectic. There is a lot going on. There's a lot to talk about, and then there's the question: are you going to have a bad weekend because of all this? Not necessarily. With astrology, there's always this capacity for exaggeration and hyperbole. I can go on and on about how dreadful the position looks like, and then, in terms of your experience, the weekend may just be nothing. May just be another weekend, nothing much to worry about. And for most of you, that's probably the case. On a global political level, a lot of things to be worked up about. Well, yes, things could be happening. I do think that tension levels are going to be high this weekend. So if you're in government, or you're negotiating between governments, or you're trying to stand up for your country, then there is certainly a lot to consider. So let me now look at the weekend from the viewpoint of the 12 signs. So these are my forecasts for the 12 signs for the weekend of April the 12th and 13th, 2025. Aries, there is a full moon this weekend, and this weekend is likely to have an impact on you. I mean, that really can't be avoided because the moon is in Libra and the sun is in Aries. So in other words, that is across the main axis of your chart. And this full moon, you might think that would have an effect on relationships. That's the first thing one would consider. And so if you think about the symbolism of the full moon, you've got the sun in Aries. That's arguably you. It's in your sign. And there's an opposition from a moon in Libra. And the moon in Libra might represent another person, someone you have to take into consideration. And Sun in Aries, it's strongly placed. It's exalted in Aries, and so you, as a person, could actually be quite overwhelming. You have a strong personality, and sort of Moon in Libra, under a bit of pressure, especially as it's in the Via Combustor, may not be always able to deal with you. You may be too much to handle. So as you look at relationships, ask yourself, does the other person really feel comfortable? And really ask yourself, what impact are you having? Try to look at yourself from a third-party perspective, and you can then hopefully moderate your behavior. You might not need to moderate your behavior, but just consider the possibility that whatever you do gets noticed. It has an impact, and in certain cases you could have a negative impact. You may be quite intimidating, and if you want to be effective this weekend, you can't see everything in terms of yourself. You do have to consider the other, because the other, even if the other is in a weaker position than you, the other can still mess things up, can make it difficult for you to operate in the way you'd like to. And also, the moon in Libra, may not represent people. It may represent events, just what's happening around you, and you having to take it into account. Because if you don't take it into account, you could be messed up. And full moons are about realizations, and with the full moon with the full moon, you might have a realization about another person or about a particular relationship you're in. The truth might be in front of you, and the truth can be good or bad. The truth can be about realizing how awful someone is, but it could also be about realizing how wonderful they are. So it can work both ways. And don't forget that this full moon is tied up with Chiron. There is a Sun-Chiron conjunction over the weekend. And this may say something about you wanting to do things differently. And it's good that you want to do things differently. You're being an Aries, and you don't want to hold back, but you have to deal with the contradiction presented by the full moon. And that contradiction is, you want to be yourself, but you also want to be respectful. You want to be free, but you have to be responsible. And getting that balance right could be hard work, but I do think that you can do it. And if we look at the meaning of Chiron, it can be the rebel, but it can also be the healer, and perhaps it can be both. And at the highest level, this full moon conjunct Chiron may just give you an opportunity to really help people out in a quite dramatic way. Yet you can do it if that's what you want. Said it's not going to be 100% easy. Yeah, it is all about balance. Full moons are about balance, particularly a full moon in Libra. But Aries, if you just show a little bit of sensitivity and self-reflection, then I do think that you can make the very most of this lunation. Taurus, Venus is going stationary direct. It happens this weekend, and Venus is your ruler. It's been going retrograde for some time. When did it go retrograde? Venus went retrograde. When did it go retrograde? It went retrograde some time ago. It went retrograde at the beginning of March. And so, since the beginning of March, over the last, 6 weeks or so, things may not always have been easy. You could have been indecisive at times, and you might not have known, what you were supposed to be doing, and you may have changed your mind on numerous occasions, and you might even have felt that you were kind of floundering. And Venus has been under so much pressure recently, and it's not just the fact that Venus is retrograde; it's the fact that it's been very close to Saturn, and there was a long time when it was in Aries, and then it went back into Pisces, and when it went back into Pisces, it was exalted, but it was still conjunct Saturn. So you have been under pressure recently, and you may have felt that you weren't able to make clear and clean decisions. But now that Venus is going direct, things are slowly returning to normal. It's not going to be an immediate process, and it may not really come together fully until Venus goes into Taurus. Venus goes into Taurus. When does Venus go into Taurus? Venus goes into Taurus. Okay, I know that's a long time. I know that's not until June, but that's a time when Venus is completely out of the woods. Venus is, in its own sign, and that's something to look forward to. But overall, Venus is getting stronger and stronger now. Okay, Venus will go into Aries and go into the sign of its detriment, but it will be familiar territory. So if you've been feeling completely confused recently and you don't know what to do, Venus going stationary direct is a changeover. And Venus will make a conjunction to Saturn again as it goes forward, but you've already had the Venus Saturn conjunction. You know what it's all about. And to be more specific about Venus going stationary direct, you may have a better understanding of other people, of, for example, your friends and your social life, and you may not really have known who your real friends were. And now with Venus going stationary direct, close to Saturn, perhaps you're having some insights here. And additionally, with Venus going stationary direct, it may relate to some of your plans for the future. Not concrete plans about how much money you're going to make, how you're going to realize some of your ambitions. Not like that. I'm talking more about the long-term future, more about something that is inspirational and existential. What are you here for? What would you like to do? What makes you feel good? What makes you feel accomplished? What are your hopes? And what are your wishes for the future? And so with Venus going stationary direct, you might realize that you are a long way short of realizing some of your wishes, but it's a start. And if you start to think about the kind of life you would like to live with Venus going stationary direct, then you can start to take steps to actually make it happen. And that is something you very much can do. Not just over the weekend, but between now and the beginning of June, when Venus enters your sign. And again, that is something you should be looking forward to. And also with Venus going stationary direct, you may be an easier person to have around because you're going to be a little more decisive. So that could be fortunate for relationships because you're going to be more decisive. You didn't really know what you wanted before, but now it's becoming a lot clearer. And so don't be overwhelmed by this change. And Taurus, so the big takeaway is that now I believe that things really are getting better. Gemini, The moon is still in Libra, and it's moving through late Libra now. And so, on a positive note, that does give you a boost, especially on Saturday. I mean, I say late Libra. If I look at a chart for midnight on Saturday, actually, the moon is making a trine to Jupiter. So moon in Libra making a trine to Jupiter in Gemini, and that's a nice aspect. And so Gemini, Saturday does seem a fairly uncomplicated day, most of it, and things by and large should go your way. And I think in many cases you're going to have a lot of choice. If there's something you want to do, you want to enjoy yourself in a particular way, I think you can. And you're going to be pretty creative, and you almost start to feel this grand trine in air. It's not really a grand trine in air, it's a bit inexact, but you kind of got the moon in Gemini sort of making a very weak trine to Pluto, making a trine to Jupiter on Saturday. And so it just may feel that things are moving, and a lot of the cobwebs are being cleared out, and that you can see possibilities that just weren't there before. And you can see what you can do. And then the moon moves on, and we get a full moon. And this full moon may make you think about some of the things that are holding you back. And the question is, can you be truly creative and also take into account other people? Other people, it's great having other people around you. It's great having friends. It's great being able to socialize. But a social life is not always compatible with effective creativity. A social life can actually be a drain on your creativity. It can actually mess up the creative process. And the problem might be that one is trying too hard to take into account other people. One wants to be liked. One wants to do things that are socially acceptable, and as a result, one's creativity can suffer. And this full moon may remind you of all the things that might be messing your creativity up. You can't please everyone, absolutely not. And sometimes you have to do what you feel is right, and at first it might be quite lonely, and it's only later that society catches up with you. And so that may be one way in which we could look at this full moon. And additionally, over the weekend, you may feel a little bit nervous, and the nervousness can be seen in the chart by looking at your Mercury. So if you look at Mercury in your chart, Mercury's at 28 Pisces. Remember, Mercury is your ruler. And so Mercury is applying to a conjunction of Neptune. One of the things happening next week is that Mercury is moving into Aries. So Mercury moves into Aries. When does Mercury move into Aries? On the 16th. So what's the 16th? That would be Wednesday. I think Wednesday Mercury moves into Aries. So Mercury is getting ready to make a conjunction to Neptune, but it's moving away from a conjunction to Saturn. So what that means is that Mercury is on a direct Saturn-Neptune midpoint this weekend, halfway between the two conjunctions. And you could say, well, between a rock and a hard place. Well, not really. Between Scylla and Charybdis. Isn't that the French equivalent of the phrase between rock and a hard place, between Scylla and Charybdis? And so that can represent nervousness. There is Neptune. Neptune represents a principle of dissolving into something, being part of something higher than yourself. Saturn represents structure. You don't want to completely let go, but but at the same time, you want to get away from the structure by dissolving. But if you dissolve, well, that's not what you want. And so you're holding back. You may feel you need to hold back. There are just too many things to consider. And so I'm not telling you that you should take the plunge, but I think it's just important, Gemini, to be aware of that nervousness. And, me having my sun in Gemini, just talking about that just makes me feel ill, to be honest. I could sort of feel the beginnings of a panic attack as I'm talking right now, as I'm describing Mercury conjunct Saturn, Neptune. My anxiety levels are going up, perhaps because I'm talking about myself, and I hope I'm not projecting anything there. So this weekend, there is pressure, and you have to be composed. Not composed like, as in, get a grip, Gemini. I hate it when people don't use the phrase "get a grip" so long, but it's perhaps my parents' generation, get a grip. It seems very sort of insensitive to tell someone to get a grip, but I'm saying that to you in a softer way. You need some kind of composure here, and you need to think about what you're trying to achieve, because you can achieve a lot, and this weekend is not actually about being popular. That's absolutely not what it's about. It's doing what you feel is important, and if you can do that, and you can have integrity and be true to yourself, then I think that you'll be fine. And don't forget, Saturday, Moon trine Jupiter. That's a wonderful aspect. So really try to get going on things on Saturday when there isn't so much pressure, and then when the pressure starts to mount with the full moon, you'll be able to deal with it all. Cancer, I've talked about the full moon, I've mentioned it, and now we indeed have a full moon. And this full moon, Cancer, could be quite challenging, because it does involve Chiron, and it involves an important axis in your chart. Because this full moon is in Libra, and so Libra is a cardinal sign. Cancer is a cardinal sign, and the sun is in Aries, another cardinal sign. So it is likely to have an impact on you. And in fact, this full moon is tied up with Mars, because Mars is in Cancer. So Mars is square the sun, Mars is square the moon. In fact, on Sunday, the moon makes a square to Mars just before it moves into Scorpio. And so it could feel, Cancer, that with this full moon, that something is reaching a peak, it's reaching a culmination, and you may feel that you have to make some kind of a decision. I mean, that really is possible. And so don't take the weekend lightly. And there perhaps really are decisions to be made, and you have to consider, where are the challenges. I think at some level you're going to feel most comfortable for most of the weekend if you are somewhere that you trust. I mean, trust is going to be important, and you would like to be in control, and you'd like to know what's going on, and you're trying to avoid explosive events, but then the sun makes an opposition to the moon, and it's a very strong sun makes an opposition to the moon, and of course that's what a full moon is by definition. It's sun opposition moon, and it's the sun in Aries conjunct Chiron. It could be a challenge. It's a challenge that you're not necessarily comfortable with, but it's something you need to consider, and through other people's behaviour, through the world's behaviour, through what's happening around you. You just look at what's happening around you. You notice it all, and when you notice it all, you might feel that your first instinct is to shrink away. This is not anything you want to be involved with, but you're being given hints. You're being told perhaps what you should be doing, and what you should be doing is not necessarily what you want to be doing. And with that full moon across an important axis in your chart, it's going to be very important that you do get the balance right. You don't want to be completely stuck in your particular corner of the world and turn away. You don't want to get involved. You do need to get involved, but you need to get involved in on your terms, and don't be freaked out by another person's behavior or by what's happening around you. There's no need to be freaked out, and it's a time when you can observe, but you can also learn some valuable information about what's happening around you, and that can put you in a better position for taking constructive action. And looking at the specifics of whether it's Saturday or Sunday. So on Saturday, for much of Saturday, it may feel that the world is leaving you alone, because the moon is making a trine to Jupiter. There's nothing desperate going on, but then as you move towards that full moon, that's when the action happens. So there may be a moment over the weekend, a time over the weekend, where things are particularly difficult, particularly stressful, and then the moon changes sign. The moon moves out of Libra into Scorpio, and that sounds difficult because the moon in Scorpio has a certain difficult reputation, but from a Cancerian perspective, moon in Scorpio is probably a really good thing. So moon goes into Scorpio London time just before 3:00 in the afternoon, but if you're in the Americas, that will be this morning, on Sunday morning. So on Sunday, or at least as Sunday progresses, Cancer, things are going to get easier, and I think you'll actually quite appreciate the moon being in Scorpio, and the moon being in Scorpio may just make it easier for you to tune into yourself and perhaps be a little braver and a little more decisive, and you know what you can do, you know what your strengths are with moon and Scorpio, and you can be brave, yes, and you can feel that you're doing something that is really an intrinsic part of yourself with the moon in Scorpio, and you can tune into who you are, and perhaps you can learn the lessons of the full moon, because the full moon is showing you possibilities. I mean, full moon, okay, it's not going to be entirely easy, but it is pushing you to make the most of what you have. And maybe once the moon is in Scorpio, then you can start to put theory into practice. Leo, the sun is in Aries, and it's been in Aries for some time, and it's going to be in Aries for another 7 days, another week almost. And so overall, that's good news. It puts you in a strong position. and Sun is exalted in Aries. So, don't worry too much about what is happening today. It's not going to be devastating. You're going to be able to get through it all. And perhaps, though, you are being challenged a bit because, we do have a full moon over the weekend. And, you've got Sun in Aries, but Moon in Libra is opposition Sun in Aries. And so that full moon is asking you to think again. You might think that you've got everything sorted out, you know everything. That could be just proud Leo, feeling you've got it sorted out. But Moon in Leo is saying, well, Moon in Libra is saying, maybe not. There may still be things you need to take into consideration. And so what might those things be? It might just be facts. Facts should never be ignored. And these facts might just be things that you've ignored. You thought you didn't need to consider them, but now you have another look, or you should have another look, and you realize that you haven't got all the answers. And so this full moon could be about fine-tuning and just being open-minded, listening to what other people say, and getting a complete picture. And it's only when you've got a complete picture that you can actually start to take successful action. And successful action, well, that's something you want to do, and you really want to be yourself. And the Sun is conjunct Chiron. The Sun, your ruler, is conjunct Chiron. And how this Sun-Chiron conjunction works, well, it depends how you see Chiron. If you see Chiron as being quite a rebellious energy, then that may be about you this weekend. You're not going to want to follow the rules. You're going to want to do something which is unique to you, which is a demonstration of your power. And that seems very appropriate given the fact that the Sun, your ruler, is exalted in Aries. And so you don't want to just do what everyone else expects. And that's okay. That's absolutely okay to upset things a bit. Chiron expects it of you. Though, if you are in the mood to cause upset, you perhaps have to ask why. And Chiron can represent a wound. It can also maybe represent a grievance. You feel you have been wounded. You have not been respected. Someone has maybe slighted you, and you could want to respond. And there are different ways of responding. You don't want to just cause trouble for the sake of it. If you're going to cause upset, and I think this weekend you really can cause upset, you have to ask, what actually are you trying to achieve? And going back to the full moon, there is this question, do you know enough? Are you absolutely familiar with the situation you are in? Or do you have to find out some more stuff? Because you don't want to do things on the basis of ignorance. I mean that is dangerous. And I'm thinking of there was this sitcom in I think it was in the 70s in Britain. It was called Citizen Smith, and Citizen Smith was this urban revolutionary, and he wanted to take over, have a revolution. And he had this big idea that he was going to burst into the House of Commons and Parliament and take over the country. And he actually succeeded. There was a scene where he burst into the House of Commons. But the thing is, he did it while the House of Commons was in recess and there was just no one there. It was an empty chamber. So if you want to have a revolution, you've got to get your facts right, and that full moon is asking you to indeed get your facts right. And so Leo, don't believe that you've got everything sorted out. And one final point, one thing we have this weekend is that we do have sun. The sun is on the Pluto-Hades midpoint, and I'm going to be talking a lot about the sun on the Pluto-Hades midpoint later in this video. But the sun is your ruler, and with the sun conjunct the Pluto-Hades midpoint, let me just show you what I mean. Let me just turn on the hypothetical planets to illustrate my point. So let's turn them on briefly. So you see there is Hades and there is Pluto. That's Hades. It's a hypothetical planet with a circle with a cross through it. There's Pluto, a kind of cross, I suppose. We get the symbol of the graveyard, and so, or a grave, and there's Pluto, there's Hades, there's Pluto. Now the sun is right between them, and so that might impact you. And I don't think it's going to impact you in a negative way, but it's going to impact you in terms of awareness. And Hades and Pluto does, as a pair, represent everything that is perhaps wrong with society, and things are falling apart. It's decay, disintegration, and that's the world in which you're working, and that's the way it is. And so when you're planning your initiatives, whatever you're trying to do this weekend, that's the situation you're in. And it's the same for all of us, but maybe you, Leo, because the sun is your ruler, and the sun is on the Pluto-Hades midpoint. You're just particularly aware of it at the moment. Virgo, we have the moon in Libra for the first part of a weekend, and then it moves into Scorpio. So with the moon in Libra, well, it's making a full moon, and the full moon is going to have an impact on all of us, Virgos included. And this full moon is across the financial axis of your chart. It doesn't mean to say that money is going to be an issue this weekend, but it's just something that we do need to consider. And so the financial axis, in the jargon, that's the second house, eighth house. Second house in astrology represents personal finances. Eighth house represents joint finances or complicated money. And so with this full moon, there could be financial realizations, and it's not a time to be closing your eyes to financial matters. You might like to, because it makes things easy or easier, but if something needs attention, then you've got to do what you can. You can't just assume that things will just sort themselves out all by themselves. And so don't be afraid of your bank account. Don't be afraid of legal documentation. Don't be afraid of asking questions. Because if you ask questions, if you explore things, then you're going to come up with answers. Now, these answers may not always be what you're looking for, but they're what you need. You need to be informed. And as a Virgo, I think that is something you appreciate. That you have to know what's going on. And it might be at times difficult to be grounded. And Virgos do need grounding, and you might not know what's going on, but just by asking the right questions, then you can make yourself feel a lot better. And Virgo, don't get worried. there's some danger of that. Mercury is very close to, at the moment. Mercury is getting ready to move into Aries, and it's quite close to a conjunction of Neptune. It's also quite close to a conjunction of Saturn. So you're getting a sort of Saturn-Neptune influence over the weekend in terms of how you feel. And you're just afraid that if you go too far, you might be opening something up that you just can't deal with. But also, you do want to be part of something bigger than yourself. And when it comes to exploring things, you may feel that you don't want to explore things. It's almost better not to know, but it is better to know. So don't be afraid. Don't feel that ignorance is ignorance is bliss. Ignorance might be bliss in the short term, but not really. You're still going to be tense because you know that the facts are out there, and you need to familiarize yourself with these facts. Now, the moon does not stay in Libra all weekend. It does move into Scorpio at some stage, and so the movement into Scorpio, as far as you're concerned, may actually make you feel a whole lot better. So when does the moon move into Scorpio? Well, if you're in the Americas, the moon moves into Scorpio this morning. If you're in Europe, that will be this afternoon. Okay, if you're in Australia, it will be. It might not be until very late this evening or into tomorrow. But whenever the moon does move into Scorpio, it's going to break up some of the intensity of the full moon, because when you've got the full moon, you've got a sun in Aries, opposition moon in Libra. When the moon moves into Scorpio, that intensity just starts to diminish, and you start to also get a perspective, and you can feel the way things are going, and you're not going to be quite so nervous, and it's going to be easier for you to ask questions, because at the height of the full moon there was that fear, but I think the fear does diminish as you move into Sunday, and you're better able to deal with the facts, and you're able to ask the questions that need to be asked. I mean, a moon in Scorpio does actually make a conjunction to true black moon Lilith, because true black moon Lilith is in early Scorpio. So, but with that moon conjunction of true black moon Lilith, that allows you to get to grips with complicated issues. And I just don't think you're going to have the kind of worries that you would have had while the moon was in Libra. So Virgo, it's important that you're able to confront things. Okay, it is a weekend, and the weekend is supposed to be a relaxing time. Is it going to be a relaxing weekend? All things are being equal, probably not. But could it be a useful weekend? It could actually be an extremely useful weekend. And if you're ready to learn, and you're ready to discover, and you make the truth your number one goal, the way to judge everything, if it's true, if you're finding the truth, then that is the right thing to be doing. If you elevate the truth to the pinnacle of your priorities, that's the number one priority. If you can do that, then I think that this weekend could be very effective, and you're going to be a more informed person and a wiser person, and you'll be in a position next week to take constructive action based on knowledge. Libra, the big event is, of course, Venus going stationary direct. So Venus, your ruler, has been retrograde since the beginning of March. And Venus being retrograde has had its problems. It hasn't been especially easy, and may have been moments where you really felt indecisive. You just didn't know, and you weren't sure. You weren't sure what was going on. You weren't sure what you wanted to do. You may have moved in one direction for a bit, then had second thoughts, and so it was quite difficult maybe to get things together. Not least, well, because of Venus going retrograde, but there are other things going on. Venus has not been in a great position. Venus, it was conjunct the Sun, and then now it's conjunct with Saturn, and it perhaps has been hard, but with Venus going stationary direct, it's indicating that things are starting to normalize, that you now have a clearer sense of what needs to be done, and part of that is just through experience. You've seen it all, you've tried things, you've maybe failed at a few things, but now things are starting to come together, but slowly. And perhaps the most important thing is to be able to make clear decisions, and now that is much easier. And there are many things you can make decisions about. Other people, for example, because one of the big events, it's not just the fact that Venus is going direct, another big event is the full moon. And this full moon is in Libra. The full moon is in your sign. And we've got moon in Libra opposition the sun in Aries. And this is happening across the main axis of your chart. And this axis, the Aries-Libra axis, is often about relationships. And with this full moon, you can get important insights into other people, and you can sort of understand what makes them tick, why they're doing what they're doing, and whether they're good for you. I mean, some people are good for you, other people aren't, and this is a time where you can make that decision, where it will become clear. And in terms of relationships, it's a time for honesty. And you have to be honest with yourself. Don't fall prey for wishful thinking. And remember that people don't change. I know people are supposed to change, but the reality is that people don't change. And if someone has behaved in a particular way in the past, they will behave in a particular way in the future. And that can be good, that can be bad. And so with this full moon, you may finally get it about another person, and it will become clear. Now, problem with the full moon is just because you know the truth of the matter, just because you know the whys, but it doesn't mean to say you're going to do anything. That does seem to be a problem with therapy. I haven't been in therapy for a very long time. I was in the 90s for a few years. In the early 90s, I was in the 90s in general. I did have a couple of years when I saw a therapist, and what I noticed about being in therapy is it's very useful for understanding what's going on and why you are who you are, but actually changing it, well, that's a completely different matter. Knowledge doesn't necessarily help, and so that might be what this full moon is about, but it needn't be about this. You can make changes, and there can be changes of personnel. You might, with this full moon, decide that you want to get closer to some people, but further away from others. And it's not just a full moon. On Saturday, by the way, the moon is making a trine to Jupiter, and that moon trine Jupiter, by the way, it's a really good aspect, and it allows you to get perspective. Moon in Libra making a trine to Jupiter is fortunate. Jupiter is a planet of good fortune, and you can start to see things from a broader level, and that allows you to get various complications in perspective. You perhaps appreciate that some things aren't as bad as they seem or as complicated as they seem, and you just get a vision of how you'd like things to be. And so when you get into that full moon and you have those realizations, you can see that if you give something up, or even give someone up, you're creating other opportunities in other directions. And it's all so much easier because Venus is going stationary direct, because you're finally getting some movement, and you can take that movement, and you kind of know what you want. But knowing what you want isn't the whole story. You actually have to take action, and maybe Libra, that's the challenge. Scorpio, the moon does actually move into your sign this weekend, but it happens later in the weekend. It happens on Sunday. On Saturday, and perhaps part of Sunday, the moon is moving through Libra, the sign just before Scorpio, and the moon is making it. There's a full moon, and this full moon might have an impact on you. It might weigh on you. It may feel that there are important issues to think about, to be concerned about, and you might feel that you want to hold back. You're still trying to work it out, and you're just not ready. And that may say something about your behavior on Saturday. You may not be in the mood for doing certain things, especially of a social nature. So if you had made arrangements to go to a party or to meet someone, and you're having second thoughts, well, maybe you should trust your judgment. Because if you're not feeling good about something, then why proceed with it? And also with this full moon, things are a little bit delicate, and so you don't want to be forced to do something you don't want to do. I mean, Scorpios should never do that. Scorpio is a stubborn sign, and you know what you need to do. You know what you want to do, and so perhaps you should just hunker down while this full moon becomes exact. Now, one thing about this full moon is that it is conjunct Chiron, and so it's actually opposition Chiron technically, because we've got the moon in Libra, opposition the sun, and the sun is conjunct Chiron. And so this Sun-Chiron conjunction in Aries may work in several different ways, and it might, in your case, have something to do with health. Could be mental health, could be physical health, and you may be spending more time than usual considering health. And I'm not predicting that your health is going to be bad. Far from it. Chiron is a planet of healing. I mean, that could be self-healing. So Sun conjunct Chiron in Aries at the time of a full moon might just be, Scorpio, about you realizing what you need to do to put yourself back in sync with the universe, your mind and body in sync. And at the same time, if you take the wounded healer symbolism of Chiron, knowing where the wound is, knowing what has messed you up, and doing something about it. And that could be the full moon on Chiron. You know what has been going wrong in the past, and you're then maybe in a position to actually do something about it, and just change your routines, change your lifestyle, things that you actually have probably been working on over the last few weeks anyway. But with Sun conjunct Chiron, it's all becoming very clear. So that is certainly one way in which the Sun Chiron conjunction could work. It could actually work with you as the healer, you do actually have the healing touch with Sun conjunct Chiron. And so there may be things you can do to help other people, not just people, just other entities, maybe animals as well. So that's something you might want to think about with Sun conjunct Chiron. You're quite good at the moment, or at least better than usual, at being able to diagnose things, being able to understand, what the root of a problem is, particularly a health problem. And again, I must emphasize that I'm not giving medical advice here. I'm talking about just lifestyle stuff. I'm certainly not talking about specific ailments. It's very general, and of course this channel, these forecasts are for entertainment purposes only. And there is another dimension to the Sun-Chiron conjunction, which may have nothing to do with health. And this full moon may actually really focus on you as an individual. And there may be something you decide you want to achieve that is completely personal to you. It's you. And it could relate to your work. It might not, but it could. But you know that you want to do something differently. And you know that you've got the answers. And you know also perhaps that other people have got it wrong. And it occurs to you that maybe you have to make a fuss. You have to make a display of your rebelliousness and your individuality. That, of course, does involve some risk, but it may be a conclusion that you're coming to, and you may be coming to that conclusion very quickly. And finally, on Sunday, the moon does move into Scorpio. And I don't want to say too much about it, but with the moon moving into Scorpio, things just get better, and things get easier, and you just feel more present and more in control, and that will take you through into Monday. And when I do your forecast for Monday, I'll go into further detail about what it means for the moon to be moving into Scorpio, particularly in terms of other things going on in the sky. Sagittarius, we can't avoid the fact that there is a full moon. The full moon affects everyone. I don't think that for you this full moon is particularly dramatic. It's a more gentle influence. As far as how you'll experience it, I think that part of it is trying to work out where you as an individual fit in with everything. And at the moment, Sagittarius, I think that you do have a strong sense of your own individuality. You want to do things very much your way, on your terms, but at the same time, you're aware of constraints. There are always constraints, and those constraints might be placed upon you by the social world in which you have no choice but to interact. Other people have their own ideas. Your friends have ideas. And they may not always be compatible with your ideas. And the temptation is to just do things your way and to be quite selfish about it. I don't think it's a time to be selfish, though. I think that you have to compromise. I mean, you can't compromise yourself. That's not what you're being asked to do. But you are being asked maybe to meet people halfway, or at very least to consider other people. They have their own sensibilities, and they're also their own vulnerabilities. And if you ignore that, then you could just create a big mess, or you might find that you and other people are estranged from one another. And I don't think that would be necessary, but I just think there is this capacity for this full moon to cause social disruption. And you don't want to be too precious about what you believe in and how you want to enjoy yourself. Weekend people often have ideas about what they want to do, and this weekend there could well be differences of opinion, and you just have to show a capacity for tolerance. And so that's possibly one of the things going on. I would have said that probably Saturday is going to be an easier day than Sunday, because on Saturday we have a trine between the moon and Jupiter, and this trine between the moon and Jupiter, well, it happens before the full moon, and so you may have a chance to do what you want, how you want on Saturday. And if you want to be an individual, and there's something you really want to do, it's really important to you, then get it done as early as possible. Because if you leave it too late, you might lose the opportunity. And the reason you'll lose the opportunity is because just things happen, and things do become more complicated. And then as you move into the weekend, the moon moves later and later into Libra, and as moon moves later and later into Libra, things do get more difficult, things get more complicated. The moon is, of course, in the Via Combustor. Moon in the Via Combustor, things can happen that you weren't expecting. Maybe other people will make announcements or make decisions that have an impact on you, again, that you hadn't planned for. And then the moon moves into Scorpio, and when the moon moves into Scorpio, then it's more difficult to really assert yourself. And by when the moon moves into Scorpio, you might just feel that there's really nothing you can do, and that you perhaps need to lay low for a little. And as you go into the next week, as you move into the new week, you may find yourself being quite reflective, and you're not ready to take action, and perhaps you're still sort of taking on board the full moon, and what the implications of that full moon will be. Capricorn, we have a full moon, and I do think that this full moon is important. And this full moon is across one of the main axes of your chart, because it's a moon in Libra. Moon is in a cardinal sign, and Capricorn is a cardinal sign, and so this full moon could actually be pretty motivating, and you may find yourself making decisions or wanting to make decisions. And remember, this full moon takes place at the same time as Venus going stationary direct. So Venus, for you, may say something about your ambitions, and it's been retrograde since I think the beginning of March, and so it goes stationary direct. It comes to a standstill, and things start to become clear. And it happens at the same time as a full moon. I mean, literally at the same time as a full moon. The full moon and Venus going direct, they take place within 41 minutes of each other. So that is very close. And so Capricorn, perhaps this weekend could actually be something of a turning point, where things change. You become more decisive, and you're ready to move forward with things. And it may feel that you're taking action in an overall situation which is quite unstable. and you're not 100% confident with the way things are, and you're just being realistic, and you see that it's, things aren't going to be easy, but the full moon gives you an insight into what actually needs to be done, and you have realizations, about what has been holding you back. And it could be that there were things that you took for granted, that you assumed were just a permanent part of the scenery, and then you realize, well, maybe not. Maybe the scenery can be moved, or maybe the scenery needs to be challenged. You don't like something, it's blocking your light, and it's blocking your ability to see the world for what it is. So you change the scenery, and that can change everything. And it might literally be changing the scenery. That this full moon may say something about your relationship to your home and how your home is organized, and perhaps your home was organized in a way that was holding you back, but now you see it, and you know what you need to do. So Capricorns may seem busier than usual. So when Capricorns get observed, they're doing lots of stuff, and more stuff than usual. You may not even realize it, but actually something is going on. There's someone running past, and so the dog feels she needs to express herself. Sorry about that. And so Capricorn, it is a case, I think, that you are becoming a lot clearer. And as far as the difference between Saturday and Sunday, on Saturday there is a trine between Moon in Libra and Jupiter, and so something you're working on Saturday, or something you're involved in, may actually go very easily. It's easier than expected, especially if you're not disturbed, or at the very least you're working with people who you understand. Everyone knows what they're doing. So Moon trine Jupiter, something moves easily, and best to get it done earlier. I mean, as the weekend progresses, things do get, in a way, a little bit more difficult, but probably a little more satisfying, because you're going to be very good at the moment about dealing with challenges. And so Capricorn, it's actually going to be a good weekend. I mean, it's not going to be a fun weekend, but you don't want a fun weekend. You want a productive weekend, and you will probably get the support you need, if need be. Moon trine Jupiter, that could be about relationships, the right relationships. Certain people are going to be helpful and supportive, though don't make complete assumptions about any one person, because the moon is in the Via Combuster, and with the moon in the Via Combuster, certain people might do things that weren't entirely expected, or things might happen to them which has an impact on their behavior. So if you find that someone has a change of plan, or says they can't do something, I don't think this will happen, but it could happen. If that does happen, don't get annoyed. It's just the moon moving through the Via Combuster. But I think that people are going to be reliable enough, but there are limits to everyone's reliability at the moment. Aquarius. The moon starts the weekend in Libra, which is a nice sign for the moon to be in, at least from an Aquarian perspective, because the moon, while it's moving through Libra, it makes a trine to Pluto. I think I've already talked about that trine to Pluto, and it also makes a trine to Jupiter. So on Saturday there could be a certain sort of grand trine feel to the day. Things are just moving easily, and you may find that it's sort of easy to think things through, and if you have ideas, they can actually work, or it may feel they can work. And if you talk about your ideas, it's all working very well, and that might give you real optimism. And with that moon trine Jupiter on Saturday, don't hold back. It might feel that just anything is possible, and if you've got an idea, just see how far you can take it, and don't be afraid of new information, getting involved in something that you don't fully understand, but it could be interesting. So if something is interesting, then see how far you can take it, and don't hold back. But as the weekend continues, things do get a little more complicated. The moon, it moves through Libra, but then it moves into the Via Combusta, that part of the sky between 15 Libra and 15 Scorpio. And of course, when it moves into the Via Combusta, it then moves on towards a full moon. And so, with the full moon, you might suddenly get a feeling about your limits, and you can take an idea only so far, but then you have to deal with reality, and that can be tough. And you have to also ask, is it real reality or is it fake reality? So what's fake reality? Someone being excessively cautious, telling you can't do something, telling you're being just unrealistic. It may not be another person, it may be you yourself having doubts with the full moon. Can you really do it? Are you really strong enough to do it? And it's very important, Aquarius, that you have a sense of perspective. It's always good to ask questions, but you don't want to reduce yourself to a situation where you can't do anything, where you're just racked by doubts for the sake of it. And you may well be influenced by other people and their responses. The Sun is making a conjunction to Chiron, and with the Sun conjunct Chiron, that may be not about you, it may be about another person getting a lot of attention, getting a lot of your attention. And the question is, who is more important, you or this other person? And there may be a tendency to give other people's opinions more weight than your own. And that is not a good situation for an Aquarian. You have to be independent-minded. Yeah, sure, take into consideration what other people say, but you can't be completely dominated by another view. But you might just be a little bit self-conscious, and you might think, well, someone else's view is, in some way better than your own. And that's not something that you should really countenance. So you have to get that balance right. You have to get the balance between you as an inspirational person, and you are a very inspirational person, and also you have to balance out that with reality. And you just don't want too much reality, because reality could spoil the weekend. And as I said, reality can be fake. That really is possible. And as the weekend progresses, the moon moves later and later through the sign of Libra, and then it moves into Scorpio. And that movement into Scorpio, it could actually be quite a good thing for you. So as far as when the moon moves into Scorpio, well, it's going to be on Sunday morning if you're in the Americas, Sunday afternoon if you're in Europe, late on Sunday and perhaps even into Monday if you're in Australia or New Zealand. But when the moon moves into Scorpio, I do think that things will become clearer, and also the pressure of the full moon will will start to wane. Well, the moon will be waning, but it won't have such a big influence, and you'll be able to get a perspective on the matter, and you'll be able to fine-tune things. You have ideas, other people have ideas, you've got your identity. It's very important that you respect that identity, but when the moon moves into Scorpio, you'll be aware of what needs to be done, and you'll have a sense of purpose, and this sense of purpose will take you through into the new week, and you'll just know what needs to be done. And I think you'll be quite single-minded about it. And another thing going on this weekend is that Venus is going stationary direct, and Venus is in Pisces, and Pisces is a sign that's often connected with money from an Aquarian perspective, because Pisces is a sign following Aquarius. And so with Venus going stationary direct, Venus is potentially a planet of money. And so with Venus going stationary direct, you perhaps have an understanding of a financial matter that in the past had been very difficult to reach. So Venus has been going stationary direct since the beginning of March, and when Venus moved into Pisces, because Venus was in Aries, it went stationary retrograde in Aries. When it moved back into Pisces, that's when there might have been a sense of financial indecision. You weren't quite sure what to do, and you weren't certain about money, and it was all a bit up in the air. But with Venus going stationary direct, something financial may be starting to clarify. And it's not that you have to do anything right now, but do think about money over the weekend, and think about what has changed and how something is making more sense. And it may be a realization. The realization could be fortunate. It could be optimistic. It may mean that you have to accept a situation. But whatever it is, financially, Aquarius, I think very soon you can actually take action on it, and I think it's going to be easier to make financial progress, as a result of Venus going stationary direct. Pisces, it's a weekend where we've got quite a lot going on. We've got a full moon, and we've got Venus going direct, and it is confusing for a lot of people. I mean, I think it could be a difficult weekend, not just for you, but for everyone. Difficult, not because things are bad, but possibly because things are just a little bit complicated, and you're not quite sure where things are going. And as a Pisces, you're probably quite good at dealing with things that are rather ambiguous, and you might even have an advantage. So if things happen that are unexpected and are unannounced, then you may be in a position to respond in a way that is effective. And this full moon is about the things that you don't normally want to deal with or even need to deal with them, but especially over a weekend. But this weekend is a weekend where you have to confront things, where you have to accept things, and you shouldn't be afraid of looking under the surface. You do not take things at face value, and you're not going to find the answers in writing. It's not going to be all laid out for you. You have to find the answers, and that means you have to sort of dig deep. But full moons are about realizations and understandings, seeing the truth. And this full moon does offer you answers, but it's not going to give you the answers on a plate. You have to actually look for these answers. You have to delve for them, and you have to dig perhaps quite deep down, but eventually you can find what you're looking for. And these answers, they could relate to money and financial truths. They could have an emotional dimension as well. It's often difficult understanding why people are who they are. What is their motivation? But if you're prepared to look at another person closely enough, you can get some real insights into their personality and into their motivations, and that's going to make things easier for you, I think. And in general, the weekend, it has its ups and downs. I think that the weekend might have 3 phases. So the first phase of the weekend, the early phase, is perhaps characterized by the fact that the moon is making a trine to Jupiter. And the weekend may actually start off quite easily. Things just flow. There's no pressure. You can do things in your own way, and you can gain some quiet satisfaction with what you're doing, especially if you spend time in your home and you feel that there isn't much pressure. But then the central stage of a weekend is when things do start getting complicated, and it's to do with that full moon, and also the fact that Venus starts going stationary direct, and things are not as easy to work out. But that's where you have to try. That's the moment where information is available if you're prepared to look for it. And then there's the final stage of a weekend when the moon changes sign. And moon changes sign, in other words, from Libra to Scorpio. This could be Sunday morning. It could be Sunday afternoon. Well, it's certainly Sunday morning if you're in the Americas. Sunday afternoon if you're in Europe or Africa. Sunday evening, or perhaps into Monday if you're in Australia or New Zealand. But that final stage when the moon moves into Scorpio is just easier. And by the end of the weekend, you could feel a certain sense of renewed relaxation. You've understood things. You've confronted things. Now you've confronted things. You perhaps have confronted people, and you're much nearer to the truth. And perhaps as Sundays changes into Monday, there can be a sense of relaxation and a feeling of knowledge, quiet knowledge, and that means that you'll be ready for the new week and its challenges. So don't panic about this weekend. There could be moments when things are difficult, but I do think that things will pass. And additionally, you can come to some answers. You can really understand what is going on. But you've just got to be honest, and you've got to just really keep looking until things become clear. And those are my forecasts for the 12 signs, and I now want to look at the weekend from the viewpoint of the I Ching. And so I asked the question, what is the weekend going to be like for those watching the I Ching section of this video? And the first hexagram I got was hexagram number 20, which is contemplation. And this hexagram doesn't move. There are no moving lines. And so we have a hexagram which is pretty passive, and it has no moving lines. So that's suggesting that in terms of our weekend, we should just take it easy. It's not a time for doing anything. It's just a time for contemplation. And the symbol of this, at least according to the Wilhelm translation of the I Ching, sort of represents a tower. And maybe it's a tower where we can view things. And that is, according to Wilhelm, another way of looking at contemplation. It is about view. We watch. We don't participate. And we form ideas, but we recognize we haven't got any answers, and we also recognize that it's a complicated situation in which we're in. Not necessarily us personally, but the world is complicated. If we were to respond to everything going on around us, it would drive us crazy, wouldn't it? And so, when we look at the astrology of the situation, we've got full moon this weekend, we've got Venus going direct. I talked about, the sun being on the Pluto-Hades midpoint, in fact, the full moon being on the Pluto-Hades midpoint. Do we really want to get involved? And we are talking about things happening on a very large scale, on the big world stage. Can we do anything about it? No, we can't. And if we try to get involved, well, it's not going to work. So we don't have to do anything. We shouldn't actually feel any pressure. Now, the nuclear hexagram for contemplation, if you take off the top and the bottom lines, so if you knock off the top line, you knock off the bottom line, the nuclear hexagram you get to is splitting apart. And that tells us so much about what is happening. This is not, splitting apart, by the way, is not what we're experiencing. It's just providing a background. And splitting apart is about everything coming to pieces. It could be about Trump, the global order, globalization coming to an end. Everything is changing, and the splitting apart may not just be about the world. It may be about your community, your society. It's all coming apart, and you don't have to be part of it. You're in the middle. You're just watching it all, and your job is to do nothing. It's to contemplate, to take notes, to observe. And if you can do that, you'll be fine. At a later stage, you can take action. But when you actually do take action, you'll be informed. And how do you become informed? Well, you just observe, you watch, you contemplate. And now I want to go back to the chaos of the weekend's astrology. Maybe it's not that chaotic. But yesterday, on Friday, I looked at the full moon, and I went into the full moon in some detail. I actually want to come back to the full moon because it's so close to Venus going stationary direct, and Venus going stationary direct is one of the events of the weekend. So I set up a chart for the moment of Venus going stationary direct. So here it is. Set this for London. So this takes place at 2:03 p.m. 2:03 a.m. London time. So London time, Venus goes direct 2:03 a.m. and the full moon is at 1:22 a.m. So the full moon and Venus going direct are within 41 minutes of each other in terms of time. And so that, I think, is significant. It's not that the full moon in itself is necessarily significant, or that Venus going stationary direct is significant. When you put them together, that's a powerful changeover. And I think we might see the effects. Well, we could see them over the weekend, but we could see them into next week. And as I said earlier, it'd be interesting to see what the stock markets do on Monday. Though you could argue, with Venus going stationary direct and with this full moon, and this full moon is of course on the Pluto-Hades midpoint, this could be as bad as it gets. We talk about T.S. Eliot talking about T.S. Eliot talking about April being a cruelest month. This may be peak cruelty. This may be where things are as bad as they get now. This is the peak of it all. And if we can survive this weekend, if we can survive moving into next week, then maybe things will indeed start returning to normal slowly. And of course, we've got Mercury moving into Aries, and that happens on Wednesday. So things are changing. Of course, Mars is very late in Cancer now. So Mars Mars will move into Leo. When does Mars move into Leo? Mars moves into Leo pretty soon, on the 18th. So we've got next week we've got Mars moving into Leo. So things are changing, and maybe that is about normalization. And so as far as Venus going stationary direct is concerned, I regard this as the beginning of Venus's recovery. And the recovery becomes full at the beginning of June, when Venus moves into Taurus, into its own sign. And so when you're talking about Venus, you could be talking about relationships, you could be talking about beauty, aesthetics, you might be talking about war, because I think Venus could be a planet of war, and I've discussed this before, and it's war as in victory. And so from a military perspective around the world, with Venus going direct, you could see things moving. There's strong indications, for example, that Russia is preparing a sort of a big offensive. Everyone is saying this. Ukraine is saying it. The West is saying it. There seems to be indications that things are moving in terms of the front. So that is a way in which you could look at Venus. You could also just, as I said, you can see it about beauty, and if you've been holding off on Venusian activities like buying expensive things, redecoration, buying expensive clothes, even plastic surgery, with Venus going direct, you might feel that, depending on who you are and what your preferences are, then Venus going direct may encourage you to start to be thinking about spending money, but don't be in too much of a hurry. I think that with Venus going direct, that might represent the impulse to do something of an aesthetic nature and to spend money on it, but don't be in a hurry. Venus still is going to make a conjunction to Saturn still, and Venus has got to go through Aries. So maybe you should still wait. And I return to what I said about June. Maybe you should still wait until early June, because that's when Venus has completely recovered. Because Venus is it's gone direct. It's moving through Pisces, but it's conjunct Saturn in Pisces. Then it moves into Aries, but when it moves into Aries, it's in its detriment. So there's still a lot for Venus to get through. And then finally it gets into Taurus, and that's perhaps what we're waiting for. Now, Venus goes stationary direct very close to the full moon. And so the chart of the full moon and the chart of Venus going stationary direct are quite similar. And one thing that that bothered me about this, about certainly the full moon, was the fact that it was on the Pluto-Hades midpoint. So the full moon is on the Pluto-Hades midpoint, and this is something I talked about in yesterday's video. And just a reminder of what it means for the Sun to be on the Pluto-Hades midpoint, in terms of what Alfred Witter said in his Rules for Planetary Pictures. He says, Sun on the Pluto-Hades midpoint, the man who physically fails, whose body is deteriorating, chronic disease. That's one view. That's Sun on the Pluto-Hades midpoint, Moon on the Pluto-Hades midpoint, persons unreliable, decline of people without discipline and order, excited about a nuisance, rebelling against corruption. But it is about decay and being aware that things are potentially moving from bad to worse. And just a reminder, if we look at this chart of Venus going stationary direct, but when we put in the hypothetical planets, So we put them in, and so there is the Sun, and there is Pluto, and there is Hades. And so the Sun is exactly on the Pluto-Hades midpoint, and it's the same for the full moon chart. And so this does say so much about what I think is happening in the world, and of course also in the Venus stationary direct chart. Remember, Venus goes stationary direct conjunct Saturn. Don't forget that. And so that is going to colour Venus. Venus is coming to a standstill right on Saturn. And one way of looking at Venus conjunct Saturn is financial loss. And of course, while Venus has been conjunct Saturn, people have been losing loads of money on the stock market, and the indices have really been collapsing, and we don't know how long they will collapse for. Of course, not everything has been collapsing. Gold has been doing very well, but maybe in terms of being out of the woods, when are we going to be out of the woods? Well, I'm not saying we're going to be for sure out of the woods, but just don't forget that Venus is still conjunct Saturn, and Venus is going stationary direct within just over a degree of Saturn. So that is really something that we shouldn't forget. And this Sun on this full, not just a Sun, this full moon, going back to the full moon, I do want to return to the full moon chart, which I talked about yesterday. And the fact that, here's the full moon at Sun 23, and it's, of course, involved with, connected with Chiron. And so this full moon is on the Pluto-Hades midpoint. Just to remind you of what I mean in terms of a 90-degree dial. So there it is. There's the full moon. Because it's a 90-degree dial, it shows it as a conjunction, and there is the Hades-Pluto midpoint. So the question is, what does it actually mean for the Sun to be on the moon to be on the Pluto-Hades midpoint? Now, I've just told you what it means in theory, because I've looked at Alfred Witter, and he's given the view that it's about disintegration, things falling apart. But what about in practice? I think it might be a good idea to look at some people and events who have Sun, and perhaps the moon in a couple of cases, on their Pluto-Hades midpoint. So, let's start off with a few people who have Sun on the Pluto-Hades midpoint. Now, one person who I have been talking about a lot over the last couple of years, who I've been talking about so much that I can't really talk about her anymore, and it's that woman who I've sort of gone sort of on and on about, to the extent where I've promised not to mention her name again, at least not until the autumn. So she was born on August the 4th, 1981, and there is her Sun, and it's on the Pluto-Hades midpoint. And this is, there's Pluto, there's Hades, and so what would it mean for her to have that aspect? And it's incredible how unpopular this woman is. You go to YouTube and you see so many channels, you see whole channels almost devoted to criticizing her, to telling us how awful she is, and everything she does gets criticized, and she seems to attract incredibly bad publicity. And on the face of it, her actions seem to be very self-destructive. And so this might be how her Sun on the Pluto-Hades midpoint is working. And it's also the Sun, you could say that the Sun, she seems to be obsessively focused on herself, and that further intensifies the negativity she gets. And I think one of the problems that we have in her chart is that she has a moon conjunct Saturn, and that moon conjunct Saturn is, I believe, very destructive, because in a female chart you would think that the moon represents the woman herself because it's not projected, but that Saturn maybe prevents the moon from functioning properly, so she has to function through her sun in Leo, and the sun is functioning in a slightly sort of distorted way, in a rather exaggerated way, where all the negativity of the negative aspects of sun in Leo start to work out, and then that sun is on the Pluto-Hades midpoint, and that is like her connecting to all the negativity of the collective. Sorry, I just had to mention that case. And someone else who is completely at the opposite end of the spectrum, someone who is seen as a martyr, who is seen as being very heroic, but who also reflects the sun on the Pluto-Hades midpoint, is Sophie Scholl. I mean, I do look at her chart quite often, and Sophie Scholl was executed by the Nazis because she was in Munich, and she felt she absolutely had to protest against the Nazi regime, and she put up posters, I think, in the university, and she was arrested, and she wouldn't back down. She was unrepentant, and so she was executed. And so she has sun on the Pluto-Hades midpoint. So there's Hades, there's Pluto, there's her Taurus sun, very very persistent Taurus sun. Sun is very stubborn. Sun Mercury conjunction. Very very stubborn. She held on to what she believed in. But Pluto-Hades may say something about the collective, the world, the society in which she was working in. It wasn't about her. It was about the world in which she was born in, and how it had an impact on her fate, and it in the end killed her. And another woman who had a tragic end was Carolyn Bessette. She was the wife of one of the Kennedys. I get mixed up. Was John Kennedy Jr. And he, in 1999, he flew a light plane, and he didn't really know what he was doing. I don't think he knew about night flying. And Carolyn Bessette was on board, and so was her sister. And so she had there's her son. She was a Capricorn, so, born on January the 7th, 1966, and her sun was on the Pluto-Hades midpoint. In fact, there was a kind of a grand trine between Sun, Pluto, and Hades, but Sun was really on the midpoint of Pluto and Hades. And so that might say the kind of man she was attracted to. So she was attracted to a man who led to her death, and of course it was a very public death, and so that just might be how Pluto-Hades can work. So, if you have Sun on the Pluto-Hades midpoint, maybe that's saying, well, a woman with Sun on the Pluto-Hades midpoint, the advice may be, well, be careful who you marry, because the person you marry may, in extreme situations, fly you to your death. And another person who is always in the news, I haven't talked about him so recently, and that is our friend Volodymyr Zelensky, the president of Ukraine. And so here is his sun at 5 Aquarius, and there is his Pluto, and there is his Hades, because he's got a sun Venus conjunction. And so looking at his midpoints, there is his sun on the Pluto-Hades midpoint, and he also has Venus on the Pluto-Hades midpoint as well. So here is someone who is very Pluto-Hades. And so what does that mean? Here is someone who is involved in a catastrophe, who is president of a country who is being destroyed by a war. And as far as I can see, many of his decisions have exacerbated the problem. He could have got out of this war, in terms of the Istanbul talks in 2022. There was a reasonable deal on the table, but he was persuaded to carry on, to persist. And as far as we know about Volodymyr Zelensky, and he is the head of state of Ukraine. I mean, okay, some would say he's the illegitimate head of state because his term as president has ended, but he is very persistent. He's very stubborn. He's into show. For example, you had the Ukrainian offensive in Kursk, where, according to pro-Russian sources, up to 70,000 Ukrainians died. I don't know whether that's true, but a lot of people were died, and it was a show. It was, in the end, it became a PR stunt, and he didn't want to back down by pulling out of Kursk, and that seems to be reflected in a lot of places in Ukraine, where Ukraine has just held on for too long. And so through his actions, more people have died than should have died. And I think that his influence has been quite negative. Now, Volodymyr Zelensky, when one thinks about the Ukraine war, there was this deal. There were negotiations in the spring of 2022 about coming to some kind of peace, and the negotiations were going quite well, and Ukraine had signed off on it. And the negotiations, in retrospect, were pretty bad for Russia. Putin was giving a huge amount away there. We all think in the West of Putin as some monstrous hate figure, but a lot of people in Russia regard him as being too weak. And Putin himself said, didn't he say that one of his biggest regrets was trusting the West? But the Istanbul deal, I think you could argue, was a bad deal for Russia, certainly in terms of what's happened since. And Ukraine should have taken it, but it didn't take it. And so why didn't Ukraine take it? Well, one reason was that the pressure was put on him by the West. And people talk a lot about Boris Johnson's visit to Kiev on the 9th of April. I think it was the 9th of April. And according to the story, during that visit, the West basically said to Zelensky, don't back down, don't sign off on this agreement, in Istanbul, we will support you. And so here is the chart for noon, April the 9th, 2022. And guess what? The sun, there's the sun, it was at 19 Aries. The sun was on the Pluto-Hades midpoint. And so Pluto-Hades can represent something very destructive. And that decision not to agree, not to support that agreement, not to go ahead with the Istanbul agreement, led to hundreds of thousands of Ukrainians dying. And so we're really seeing Sun on the Hades-Pluto midpoint at work there. And it's kind of interesting that Zelensky himself has Sun on the Hades-Pluto midpoint. So given the fact that Zelensky has Sun on the Pluto-Hades midpoint, it'll be interesting to see how this full moon works, because maybe he is responding to Sun on the Pluto-Hades midpoint. And so, it'll be interesting to see what's going on with Zelensky at the moment. And there are other events taking place historically. Bad people can die when the sun is on the Pluto-Hades Pluto-Hades midpoint. Reinhard Heydrich, who was the Nazi, the German in charge of Czechoslovakia after it had been occupied. He was assassinated there was an assassination attempt at the end of May of 1942, and he was mortally wounded, and then he actually went on to die on June the 4th, 1942, when the Sun was on the Pluto-Hades midpoint. The Sun was in Gemini, and there is where's Pluto gone? There's Hades, and Pluto would be, there's Pluto. So Sun was on the Hades-Pluto midpoint there, and that could be about the death of a bad man. It can also be about the fact that after his death, there was a huge amount of atrocities in Czechoslovakia. This village of Ladice was destroyed. So that says something, and all its inhabitants killed and sent to concentration camps or whatever. And so that was a bad event. That took place following the Sun being on the Hades on the Pluto-Hades midpoint. By the way, O.J. Simpson died with Sun when Sun was on the Pluto-Hades midpoint. So that's another thing that was going on, and in terms of squares, so when we're doing aspects to the Pluto-Hades midpoint, it's not just conjunctions and oppositions we need to be thinking about. It is also squares, and so the first since the Second World War, the first ship I believe to be sunk by a torpedo was the Belgrano. So when the British during the Falklands War, they sunk the Belgrano. That took place when the Sun was square the Pluto-Hades midpoint. So this ship sunk. A huge amount of people were killed, obviously. I don't know how many. I mean, there were survivors. But yeah, so that's Sun on the Pluto-Hades midpoint. That totally fits the idea of a naval disaster. And we've just seen that Rajiv Gandhi. Yeah, sorry. I looked at Heydrich was killed with Sun on the Pluto-Hades midpoint. Rajiv Gandhi, the Indian leader, was assassinated with Sun on the Pluto-Hades midpoint. So assassination is quite possible there. So the Sun represents the leader potentially, and it's on the Pluto-Hades midpoint. And massacres can happen with Sun on the Pluto-Hades midpoint. For example, the Valentine's Day massacre. So here's the chart of a Valentine's Day massacre, and so there's Hades, there's Pluto, and so the Sun was square the Pluto-Hades midpoint at the time of a Valentine's Day massacre. So I think we're getting the idea here that historically, Sun on the Pluto-Hades midpoint can be a really difficult time, and there can be assassinations, and there can be mass destruction, and the Sun on the Pluto-Hades midpoint seems to actually resonate to some extent with some of the events around Donald Trump. And so the Capitol January the 6th event, the Capitol Hill event, January the 6th, 2021, which arguably gave Trump the presidency in a way. I mean, it is kind of a bit tragic if you're an opponent of Trump, but by this supposed insurrection on Capitol Hill on January the 6th, 2021, just as the results of the 2020 election were being finalized, the sun was at 16 Capricorn, and it was square the Pluto-Hades midpoint. And so that was a bad event, and it was very traumatic for America, incredibly traumatic. And it doesn't matter what your view is, but it did seem to resonate with Sun on the Pluto-Hades midpoint, though I don't think that many people were killed. I think there's a couple. I don't know about the casualty rate, but it was a bit of a disaster for America and America's public image. I think it was great for Trump, though, because it kept him relevant and it encouraged the Democrats to pursue him through the courts, and because they pursued him through the courts, he became a martyr, and that was one of the reasons he became elected president. So you could say that the Capitol Hill events actually, in the end, benefited Trump, and yeah, it did take place when the sun was on the Pluto-Hades midpoint, and so Trump had another big event taking place when the sun was on the Pluto-Hades midpoint, and that happened on July the 13th, 2024, when in Butler, Pennsylvania, when there was the assassination attempt, the attempt that nicked his ear. And at the time of the assassination attempt, there was an exact sun square the moon. So you can see that the moon was at 2159 Cancer, the moon was at 2142 Libra, so it was a first quarter moon, and Pluto, where's Pluto? There's Pluto, there's Hades, so the moon was on was opposition the Pluto-Hades midpoint, and the sun was square the Pluto-Hades midpoint. So this was a lunation on the Pluto-Hades midpoint, and it was about an assassination attempt. And yeah, it was a failed assassination attempt, but it basically made Trump's victory inevitable. I mean, I think he was going to win anyway, but to my mind, when you saw that, there was no way that he wasn't gonna lose. Sorry, there was no way he wasn't gonna win. And you can imagine it could have gone the other way with Sun on the Pluto-Hades midpoint. You know, we saw the assassination of Rajiv Gandhi take place with Sun on the Pluto-Hades midpoint. Also, the assassination of Reinhard Heydrich. But with Trump, the assassination didn't work, but it was still a devastating event. So we now have to think about the full moon we've got this weekend, which is on the sun. Sorry, but we've got the full moon on the Pluto-Hades midpoint, and I think that Trump may very well be at the center of attention. Well, he's always at the center of attention, but given the Butler shooting and the Capitol Hill event, he perhaps has to be a little bit careful. I think leaders in general have to be careful. There's some evidence that there's a link here, but with this full moon, with assassinations, massacres. So if you're in a position of political responsibility, probably a weekend where you need to keep a low profile, and we may see things going on this weekend which do reflect the symbolism of Sun on the Pluto-Hades midpoint. So that's it. That's all I'm going to say for this weekend. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did enjoy this video, I'd be very grateful if you were to like it. If you're not subscribed, I'd be super grateful if you were to subscribe. If you want to buy me a coffee, there's a link in the description, and I will talk to you again very soon.